Hey guys, today we're going to be starting our new unit looking at mechanics. We did mechanics last unit, but we're going to continue looking at mechanics this unit. And this time we're really going to focus on forces and Newton's laws. So today, as we go ahead and get started, you can't forget what we covered last unit, or the previous unit for that matter, but we need to make sure that we're thinking in terms of forces, and we're going to introduce you some new equations. But today, really, we're just kind of giving you an understanding of what a force is and taking a look at some common forces that you're going to be dealing with as we go through this unit. All right, so let's jump in on our essential questions and get started. Number one, what is a force and when do they exist? So is there always force upon you? What does that force look like? These types of things. We need to think about this critically and talk about what actually causes a force to happen. Two, what is a net force? Is that the same or different from when we just say force? We need to make sure our vocabulary is clear so that when we're talking about these things together, that we understand what we're talking about. We want to introduce you to, and we'll cover this more times throughout not only this term but next term, what are the four fundamental forces? Okay, so these are the ones that are the fabric of the cosmos, if you will. I don't know if you've ever watched that miniseries with Brian Greene on Nova. It's fantastic, really cool. But we need to kind of identify what are these four fundamental forces and think about how they weave together the fabric of our cosmos that we live in. Number four, how are the four types of friction different from each other? I mean, they have a lot in common. Obviously, they're friction, so they're going to behave similarly in many respects. But what separates out these four different forms? And then lastly, what is the purpose of a free body diagram? We've been doing diagrams all of last unit. So the purpose of this should have some place already in the back of your mind, but we want to be very clear about the purpose of a free body diagram and what sets apart a free body diagram from any old diagram. All right. So the first key vocabulary word that we really need to make sure we understand is this term force. So what is a force? Essentially, it's a push or a pull that one body exerts on another. Now notice I said one body because gravity is a force, right? And this force is going to be applied between any two bodies that have mass. It does not need to be living. So don't think of this as something that has to be pushed or pulled in terms of a living organism making a movement. But I want you to think about the attraction and repulsion forces that exist between different objects. So when we take a look, here's an example. We've got this punter or kicker here, and this kicker is kicking the football. So what forces are exerted on the football? Okay, pause the video here, draw a little diagram of the kicker, and try and label the forces on it. Please do this in pencil so we can go ahead and take a look at it in case you need to make some changes. All right, pause the video here. All right, welcome back. So let's take a look. Well, the first and most obvious of these forces, hopefully, is the actual force of the kick, because obviously it's just left his foot. So let's go ahead and put that right on there. And this is F of kick, force of the kick. Now, as soon as it leaves his foot, and actually while it's on his foot too, you also have gravity weighing down upon it. So let's go ahead and label gravity on it. Now, if we neglect air resistance, which is what we did most of last unit, we'd be done. You essentially have done the very basic pieces of what will become our free body diagrams. We'll give you an example of what we're talking about at the end of this lecture, but we want you to understand that essentially you're looking at all the different forces that act upon an object. And then you can think about, well, if I add all those forces together, what is the result or resultant force that's produced? And this is what we call the net force. So a force is a push or a pull. Now, the only way then you have a force is if you have an interaction between two objects. So whenever you have an interaction between two objects, there's a force that acts upon each of those two objects. When the interaction ceases to happen, the two objects no longer experience the force. So force only exists as a result of an interaction between two objects. Now, we joked about this when we were doing our notes on gravity, but it's still true, and kind of keep in mind, since all two objects that are in any proximity to each other have some sort of interaction, all objects are attracted to one another gravitationally. And so we can go back to our joke about you walking up to your guy or girl in the hall that you've been totally into and saying, I know you're attracted to me. It's the laws of physics. Okay, something to keep in mind. All right, so forces and motion. If we apply a force, and we're going to see this as we get into Newton's laws in the next coming classes, a change in state of motion can occur if we have a net force. Okay? So, for example, if the force is great enough to overcome friction, the object being pushed or pulled will move, so long as the forces of an object are balanced. The state of motion described by velocity will remain the same. So if my applied force, we'll call it, in terms of one direction stays consistent and all other forces working on that object stay consistent, the velocity of the object will stay the same. But if I apply an increased force, okay, that will cause an acceleration and it will change the velocity. Now, this is where it's important to make sure we understand net force. Remember, when we did vector addition, you're basically taking all these different arrows, okay, vectors, and we're adding them head to tail to go ahead and get a resultant vector. This is essentially the same thing that we're doing, okay? A net force is when you add up all the different forces acting upon an object to see where the net force or the resultant force vector is applied. Okay, so if we take a look at this particular picture down at the bottom of the slide, what direction is this plane going to go? Well, hopefully you recognize that it's pretty obviously going to go up. Okay, the net force here is 5,000 newtons. We'll talk more about the unit. Okay, but 4,000 newtons in the upward direction. This is going to be what we call the lift force. Okay, you can see 55,000 newtons as opposed to 50,000 newtons of gravitational force. So we have more force going up, which makes the plane go up. If you take a look at the thrust, which is the forward motion, 20,000 newtons, and the drag, which is a form of air resistance that we talked about, negative 20,000 newtons, they cancel each other out. So this plane is traveling at a constant speed. It is not accelerating in the horizontal direction, but it is accelerating overall because the plane is going upward. All right. So the acceleration of a body is directly proportional to the net force acting on it. The word net is important here because it means adding all the different vectors that are applied on that particular object. Okay, so it's essentially a vector sum. Okay, you see that right here, vector sum. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind anytime we're going to be looking at these types of things. So what we're looking at is a vector. It's not wanting to write for me right now. A vector sum. All right. And hopefully you remember this is one of our key derived units that we've been talking about, and that is the Newton. Okay, kilogram, meter, second. So we've got several different units here. Now, kilogram, if you remember, is the unit for mass. Okay, meter is the measure for distance. And seconds is the unit for time. Okay, so what we're looking at here, if we think about meters per second squared, is mass times velocity divided by time. And if you think about velocity divided by time, that you should recognize acceleration. So we're looking at mass times acceleration. And you've basically done the derivation that ends up being key to Newton's second law that we'll go ahead and look at later on in this particular unit. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Now, when we start thinking about forces, most of us are going to be thinking about pushes and pulls and these types of things in terms of human interactions. But I really want you to kind of keep in mind these four fundamental forces that are at the very heart of all motion in the universe. Okay. Now, when I go ahead and put them here, I've not put them in order of their strength. And we've only gone over one of these, and that's the first one. And we'll come back to it again later in this term, I think this term, as we go ahead and go through these fundamental forces. So these should sound somewhat familiar. Number one is gravitation. That's the one we talked about when we're going over gravity and free fall. The next one is electromagnetism. This is going to be next term when we go over electricity. And when we start looking at magnetism, time permitting, then we have strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force. Now, in this course, we are not going to spend much time on these. If you really want to spend more time on strong and weak nuclear forces, I would encourage you to go ahead and take your IB Chem class. All right. So 4 fundamental forces: gravitation, electromagnetism, strong nuclear force, and weak nuclear force. And if we wanted to rank them, which we will do later on in this course, we may want to go ahead and just add here. Let me go ahead and switch to annotate. We may want to just go ahead and add that strong nuclear force is the strongest. And I know it says weak in the name, but weak nuclear force is next, followed by electromagnetism, and the weakest is gravity. Now, most of us think of gravity as being pretty strong, and so that should tell you something about the fundamental forces. Something else to kind of keep in mind, though, is you are able to overcome gravity at least for a short period of time. If you were to just stand up from your chair and take a big jump right now, you will leave the ground. You just overcame one of the 4 fundamental forces of the universe. But eventually, you lose power because you can't keep pushing off of empty air, and then you go ahead and fall back to the ground. So when we go ahead and take a look at this, we're looking at these 4 fundamental forces, and I want you to remember that the most fundamental of these is probably gravitation. So much so that every particle of matter that we know of attracts every other particle, and we're back to our joke we had again about the boy or girl you're interested in as you run into them in the hallway. So let's just go ahead and give you guys a couple of examples when we go ahead and start taking a look at forces. Now, we'll talk about these more as time goes on, but these are just some to have in the back of your mind as you're going through thinking about force. First one is tension. Now, there are a lot of mechanics problems involving objects being pulled or pushed or suspended from some string, spring, or rod, something like this. And we'll talk about this a little bit more from time to time, but this ends up being key to things like certain types of harmonic motion. If you've got a clock, for example, that has a pendulum, the force that the string or some similar object, spring, rod, whatever, exerts on the object in these types of problems is what's called tension. And so if we were to go ahead and draw that on here, your tension force would be going ahead and sitting a look at right here at this point. Okay. And so string, or in this case, the chain, is going to be pulling up on the object from here. This would be called F tens or F tension. Okay. All right. Now, most of you have probably seen this. This is what's known as Newton's cradle. Now, Newton's cradle allows these balls to swing back and forth, and you can hear the little click, 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 click. And I have a little toy one that you can kind of see in class if we ever get back. And essentially, it's a ball attached to the ceiling and is swinging on the end of a string in a pendulum motion, modeling the ball as a particle. And we can see as one hits, it sends that energy through the other balls, and then it clicks one off at the other end so that we can maintain this sense of equilibrium or balance as we go through the system. All right. Here's another. Okay, you're still looking at that same force because there's tension the tension force going up along the string, chain, whatever it is that you're looking at. And that's going against the weight, which is on the downside because of gravity. All right. Okay, we talked right before we took our test about air resistance. So also known as drag, this is the force that opposes the direction of motion because of running into those air particles. Okay, anybody who's really raced cars or built little model airplanes or rockets has some idea about how air resistance works. One of the big ones that I wish we had more time to go over, but we'll at least introduce the concept to you, is what we call friction. This is the force that opposes motion between two surfaces. Now you can experience some of this right now. If you go ahead and put your hands together and push on each other and then try and slide them across each other, you're going to feel that there's some resistance as you slide your hands back and forth. Okay. This is, if you've ever watched the Karate Kid movies, if you snack your hands together and rub them together, okay, that's what produces the heat as you begin to rub your hands next to each other. You have to be thankful for friction. We usually think of it as a bad thing, but this is what allows you to stand upright and to walk and to run. So friction does some good things too. It depends on the type of surfaces and the force that exists between the surfaces. If you have a really heavy object, that object is going to have more friction than a really light object. If you are on a rough surface, the surface is not smooth, this is going to have much more friction than a smoother surface. So more friction, less friction. And this is why if you go walking out and there's a whole bunch of ice, you can slip and fall because there is less friction between the bottom of your shoes and the surface that you're walking on. All right. Okay, so what are the four types of friction? There are four generally recognized, and you could break these down into smaller categories or just group them all together as friction, but I think it's worth identifying these different types because the amount of friction tends to be different depending on which type of friction you're dealing with. The first is static friction. This is the force that acts on an object that is not moving. So it's working well because you're not going anywhere. So if you think like a couch potato, they're exhibiting static friction. So next time you're binging some Netflix, you know about static friction. The next is what's known as sliding friction. This is the force that opposes the direction of motion of an object as it slides over a surface. Hopefully, when you're thinking about this, you're thinking about it in terms of ice skating or bobsledding. So the blade slides across the ice. As it does so, it kind of cuts into it, melts a little bit of the ice, and that creates a sliding friction as the one object goes over the other. That's a little different than what we'd see in terms of rolling friction. This is when we deal with wheels, right? So if you go rollerblading, if you go roller skating, you go skateboarding, you go cycling, right? Even in your car, if you're running in neutral, right? This is dealing with rolling friction, all right? It's the friction that exists between the wheel, the rolling part of the car, and the road. And the last is fluid friction. This is the force that opposes the motion of an object going through a fluid. So if any of you are swimmers, you've experienced fluid friction. When you're trying to dive into the water and swim as fast as possible, it's not always so easy because you are fighting against that fluid friction. But don't assume that fluid has to be a liquid. Okay, we'll talk more about this next term when we go ahead and start looking at states of matter. But essentially, a fluid is anything that an object can go through. So this includes air. Now, next time you're out driving, put your arm out the window, but hold it so your palm is facing down. You don't feel a whole lot of friction because your hand is kind of cutting through the air. But then if you turn and face your palm forward, the direction the car is traveling, you'll feel your arm get pushed back. Okay? And as your arm gets pushed back, you are going to feel an increase in fluid friction, okay? Because there's more surface area, as we talked about with air resistance. All right? So when we start looking at friction, when do we have more friction? So friction is greater between rougher surfaces, when there's a greater force between the surfaces as well. So a heavier individual is going to have more friction than a lighter individual. Okay. So these are some things to kind of keep in mind when we start looking at friction. Another key force that we're going to be talking about a lot is what we call normal force. So if a mass lies on a horizontal surface, now for this, we really want it to be something that's completely flat. Okay, so if we're dealing with something completely horizontal, we're going to deal with a normal force. This is going to be different than something that's on an angle, okay, because it doesn't fall through the floor due to the force that's opposing the mass going through the floor. All right, this is called the normal force. And so normal force is going to act perpendicular to the horizontal surface. Now, this is important because if we put an object on its angle like this, it's still perpendicular. So normal force is going to go out this way. Okay, we can label this F norm, F norm. Okay, now the size of this F normal is going to be different because this is counteracting gravity, so F of G here. But this case, gravity still goes straight down, so this is F of G here. So it's only this component, remember our component vectors, of F of G that's being balanced out by F of N. So F of N ends up being smaller. So this is an important thing to kind of keep in mind as we go ahead and continue to move through looking at this stuff. All right, so I'd like you to go ahead and take a really quick moment, pause the presentation, and go ahead and try and draw this truck and trailer. Now I want you to think about what forces are acting upon that trailer. All right, so as you do this, remember there's going to be a tow attached because that's what's pulling the trailer. It's still got wheels. It's still going to be sitting on the ground. So take a minute and think about that. Pause the video here. So welcome back. Hopefully you were able to come up with something like this for the trailer. I just used boxes, but weight's going down. The resistance force or normal force is going up. You've got the resistance force that's kind of the drag as it's going ahead and moving forward, and the tension force that's going to be pulling on it because it's pulling on the truck as the truck is pulling on it. Let's try another example. Okay, this rock lies at rest. It's currently not moving on a rough inclined slope. So what forces are acting upon the rock? Pause the video here and go ahead and try and diagram this. Okay, welcome back. So what did you get? So hopefully something like this. R represents, again, that normal force. Weight's going down at an angle because it's on a hill. And then we've got friction. So obviously there's enough friction here to go ahead and counteract the portion of this that is going to allow it to slide down the hill. All right. But these kind of things sometimes will roll down the hill rather than slide down because you end up being top heavy and you can't balance out the normal forces with the friction versus the weight. All right. Now we have this term, you've heard it before, I'm sure, in other classes, maybe your biology class, maybe in math. This is equilibrium. When there are more than one force acting on a particular object, the net force is zero if it's balanced. If the net force is not zero, it is not balanced and it's not going to be at equilibrium. All right. So here we have zero net force because the push from either side of the book is the same, meaning that it's not shifting one way or the other. There's not going to be an acceleration. It's going to stay put. This is not true in the second case here because there's more force coming from one side than there is from the other, meaning that the book is going to shift away from the side with more force towards the side with less force. So when the forces are balanced, the net force is zero. When the net force on an object is zero, we say that it's in equilibrium or it's balanced. Here's a little example. If I put a textbook onto a desk, the book's not falling through the desk, well, hopefully not. And if it's not falling through the desk, you have a normal force pushing up that's matching the F of G or the weight going down. Okay, so those two forces have to be balanced so that we can be at equilibrium. A normal force is created whenever an object is in contact with a surface, and that normal force has a strength equal to the force pressing the object to the surface, which is often the weight of the object. We can increase more books, a stack of books, put something on top of the books. As long as it doesn't fall through the table, that combined weight is going to be matching up to the normal force. Okay. You'll also hear this referred to sometimes as what we call the support force. It's supporting the object from moving through the table. Now, how do you keep track of tons of different forces in which different direction? The answer is we use a diagram. Now, I've already encouraged you guys to get used to using these drawings to illustrate points and help you keep track of directions. A free body diagram is exactly that. Essentially, you have a simplistic drawing that allows you to go ahead and apply forces to the diagram, excuse me, so you can see which direction they're acting in. And so it's very similar to what we've already done, but keeping in mind forces. So I want you to take a minute and try and draw a free body diagram for this particular situation with the books sitting on the corner of the table. So pause the video here, and then we'll take a look at your drawing. Welcome back. So what did you get? Well, hopefully you're looking something like this. We have a 200 Newton table and it's got 4 legs. So we're going to divide all of that weight out over the 4 different legs. And so if you divide 200 by 4, you get 50. And so each leg is supporting essentially 50 Newtons. Now, that's not the only thing in the drawing. You also have the 30 Newtons worth of books sitting over the other corner. So you actually have an extra amount of weight on that side. And so when we have a normal force, the normal force has to balance that out. Otherwise, the table is going to collapse on that leg. And so in that case, you have 80 Newtons pushing upward to deal with the 200 Newtons of the table plus the 30 Newtons of the books on that particular side. And this is at equilibrium because those forces of weight coming down are balanced by normal forces going up. So key thing, make sure you remember this. For an object to be in equilibrium, the net force, or the sum of all forces, must be 0. Now, it doesn't matter where they're applied in terms of it. I mean, that's not completely true because we think about the rotation that could occur if we have a central axis and misplaced forces. But if we have a solid object and we have all these different forces applying on them, if they balance out like they do here, this would be at equilibrium. Okay? All right, so I want you to think about adding forces like when we were doing our vector voyage or adding vectors. Okay, I'm going to show you a diagram of a plane, and we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about this. The 4 forces that act on the plane are weight, drag, which is a form of air friction or air resistance, the thrust of the engines, and then the lift force, which actually causes the air to flow differentially over the wings and under the wings, making the plane go upward. This is what those forces look like. Now, if the plane's going to be moving forward, okay, if it's at a constant speed, it can still be at equilibrium, staying at the same height, staying at the same speed, and we'll talk more about this as we get into Newton's laws. But if the plane is accelerating in any direction, that means one of these forces has to be outweighing the other forces. And so it's going to cause a change in the velocity of the moving of the plane. Now, if any of you have done model planes or anything like that, you probably already know some of these concepts. But what we hope to do is to go ahead and get you to think about that in terms of design. So what I would like you to do is to, if you can, get yourself a 2-liter bottle. Okay, doesn't really matter what, we just want the bottle. You can drink it, you can dump it out, but if you can get a 2-liter bottle and start collecting some materials, boxes, things like that, tape, duct tape works really well, and then we can go ahead and start thinking about designing a rocket. We'll have a day later on, and then if we ever get back in person, we can talk about maybe launching it or setting up some sort of time to go ahead and do a launch. Okay? All right, guys. So that's what I have for you today. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Leonardo da Vinci. To understand motion is to understand nature. And nature has tons of motion. Okay? But understanding the interactions, remember, force is always going to be an interaction between 2 different things, is what physics is mainly about. These interactions between different objects. Stay safe. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk to you guys soon. So long.